for the folks who are far away to have. So welcome everyone, including those who aren't with us today, Kevin and Lynn and Phil. We just did a little bit of a prayer and a check-in, and there's a number of folks, not to betray any confidences in check-in, but a theme that came up for a few of us, more than two of us, was just feeling not, what the question coming up, what can I contribute? And for some people that was because of their own stuff, or for some people it was circumstantial, for some people it was location. And I just wanted to reassure, and myself included, I was one of those people, just to reassure folks that this isn't this community isn't about a checklist or about performance. It's not about like, about this sort of elite inner group. And in fact, I think you'll see both through our stories and then by our interactions just how broken we all are. And that it's actually very messy, and that some of us may at times really shine, and I think we all do, every single one of us, but all of us are bringing a lot of baggage and a lot of self-doubt and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of questions. And so just to reassure folks that if that's the feeling, not to push it away, but also to rest with it and know that it's welcome in this group. And also, it struck me also, I don't know that Lorraine, as I mentioned in the email, isn't with us, and I don't know her reasons, but I wonder whether this is the first year we've given people the whole book, which does maybe look and feel a little daunting if it's 100 pages of this and customaries in terms of references, and maybe it's actually better to give you a section at a time so that you don't have to like look at 100 pages. So that we'll talk about, Roxy and I will talk about that, but it's interesting that some of it has come a week after, like, here's the package, can you live up to this? And, and it's not supposed to be that way at all. So just, I just wanted to say that before we jumped into what we're going to do tonight. And with that, I think I don't need to say anything more. Please do, we've been praying for Callaway, Catherine, and please do submit prayer requests. The community is always praying. But yeah, and those can either be confidential to one person in the community, or if you want the whole community to pray for something, please do just make that known, and make it known if you want it to be confidential as well, so that we don't pray for it out loud on a weekday morning. And I'm going to flip it over to Roxy, who's going to chat for a bit.
Yeah, I'm just going to actually light a candle. So for those of us that are gathered, we have something to look at. So for Catherine and Diane, if you have something to look at, you don't have to grab it now, but might be worth thinking about having some kind of icon or candle lit. Sorry.
This is a metaphor for the world.
Because
you have another box.
Just can center the gaze a little. And be just a reminder of the point of gathering, that Christ is with us. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I also wanted to say too that in discernment, one of my favorite things about thinking about our sort of Ignatian discernment is about discerning the spirits, and that the Holy Spirit kind of guides us towards something, not away from something. And so thinking about, and I do think that joining community does actually bring up some deep fears. At least it does for me. But and so to kind of expect the like up and downness of it, and to be listening to the beckoning of the Holy Spirit in the midst of it. So we're going to begin by sort of sharing our stories tonight, some of us, not everyone. But before we begin, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time, we wanted to spend a bit of time just talking about the sort of purpose of it. So the whole idea of sharing our stories is to kind of like help us as we articulate it, but also as listeners to sort of weave together sort of the threefold nature of story. So where God's story meets our story, or a community's story, so the Emmaus community, or other communities you've been a part of, and then our own individual stories. Because we aren't people in isolation from each other, and our stories kind of like interact and web together. And then in sharing them, I mean, I've been a part of so many groups where we shared our stories, and sometimes it just feels like the point of sharing it is just like forced vulnerability, and that's not really the point of this. The point of sharing our stories is in part because it does build a community, because when I know more about each of your stories, I feel a deeper sense of connection and understanding to who you are. But also articulating our own story can help clarify who we are and what we're called to. And it can help give us a sense of direction of what might be the direction in which we're going forth. And our stories are never always the same too. So, I think that's okay. The way that we articulate our story in this moment of time, I think, is something we can even think about. Like, what was new about how I shared that story that's new and different, and did I learn anything from this new way of sharing it? So it can be a place in which it can be a point of further discernment for ourselves of, oh, that's interesting how I phrased that. I wonder why. So in that point, I did want to suggest that you think a little bit about, as you're telling your story, or as you have told it, to think about how you've told it. So what was new, or what kind of keeps coming to your mind as you think about telling it, that is sort of new or different? And then, is there anything new that emerged, or a new way of saying something? And how does what I shared or will share with the group align or not align with the Emmaus community? So I think it can be a point in which, looking back over your life and articulating it, you can find ways in which it comes together with a community, or it could separate or sort of diverge from it, either of which are fine. It just can be a helpful tool. And then at some point, we're gonna, after each person shares, we're gonna have a couple people, two people, just note, like articulate a couple of themes that they heard in that person's story. So this is just a way for you as the storyteller to get a tiny bit of feedback, and to feel heard a little bit, that your story was heard and received by people, and there's something mirrored back to you, that you're not just sending this out into the universe and nothing comes back. And it can actually be really interesting to hear from other people what they heard or what themes emerged. So when you're sharing, like, or as you contemplate after you hear the story, even thinking about what other people shared or reflected. And as you share your story, you're welcome and invited, as Rob said, to name things that you want ongoing prayer for, because we do want to hold all of us in prayer as well. And then in terms of the role of the listeners, so obviously it's to listen, but in terms of what you're listening for, I would be encouraging you to be like Holy Spirit detectives, and listening for where you see evidence of God's grace or peace or joy in this person's life. What gifts of God do we see emanate from the stories that we hear? And this can be just a way for you to be co-discerning alongside the people who are sharing, And then if you feel like you notice something significant, you're welcome to share it. Be one of those two people at the end to share a theme or something that emerged. What I would encourage you not to do as a listener is to insert your story into somebody else's story, and to make assumptions about what people have shared, that it's similar to your story or it means the same thing. So I would try to take a step away from your own story, and to just really listen to what is coming from the person who's sharing. Do you have anything else that you want to say, Rob?
I mean, I think just the things that I would say are just to reiterate what we've said in the past. There's going to be elements of the story that are personal, and again, to underline the confidentiality of the room, to not go and say, Roxy just shared about whatever, let's go share that with somebody else. And certainly if you do feel that that is something that would be a conversation you want to have, to check with the person to say, hey, Roxy, you shared about the great time with your children. That's an encouraging thing. Could I share that with somebody? You know, so just to clear that, if you are feeling like that, you might want to share that. There was another point I wanted to make. It might come back to me if I don't remember it right now. But it's stories. Yeah, it'll come back to me. And so I know we're going to have a bit of a reflection time for a second, but Roxy said we're not going to get through everybody's stories. We're going to take like 20, 25 minutes per person. So both myself and Catherine are prepared to do that. If we have more time to do another person, anybody else is welcome to jump in. But we aren't meeting in 2 weeks, we're meeting in 3 weeks. And so the hope is that in these 2 sessions, we would get through most of our stories. And if we need to take another session because the stories go on a little bit, that's okay as well. So that's that. And I had another important point that I wanted to make, but I can't remember it. So I'll pass it back to Roxy and I'll remember it.
I keep taking this off and on again, but so I think what we're going to do is spend a few minutes in silence, just as a way to prepare to be listeners. I thought we could do sort of, and I'm not going to guide you in this, I'm going to let you do this, but do a bit of an examine of your life. And not a whole examine, but just the begin. You know, I don't know if you know the examine prayer, but it's like you look back over the past 24 hours of your day typically. And you look for signs of God's grace. And I was actually just thinking that you could just do that with your whole life. Only that part, looking back for signs of God's grace in the midst of your life. And I think the reason why I'm asking us all to do that is just to get us into the posture of looking for signs of God's grace in the stories that we hear around us, or in the stories that we hear tonight too. Yeah, so that's really all. Does anyone have any questions? No. Okay, so let's take about 5 minutes to center ourselves and examine our life for God's grace. And I'm going to go get the bell, and when the bell rings, we'll kind of regroup. And I think Rob will share his story. Okay.
So I don't know what the whistling is. Maybe it's the door. Is it the door? Maybe I'll try it. It's kind of cool. It's kind of creepy. So I did remember that actually two things that I just wanted to underline before anybody told their stories, myself included. One is that please only share what you wish. In all of the times, so this is round 4 or 5 of formation for the Emmaus community, different people share to different levels of depth and intimacy, and that's okay. You can tell a version of your story that is, here's the facts, I was born here. You can also share the emotional landscape. And the hope, I think some of the hope is that we get a touch of the spiritual, as Roxy said, the kind of Holy Spirit grace, where's God interacted with you. But again, some of that you may or may not be ready to share, and you might be uncertain in community. So just know that that's okay. And the other piece is that I often do this, and I think of my own life, and I will finish and I'll be like, okay, I told that story. And then I'll be like, good Lord, I never mentioned my kids. Or I never mentioned like activism, even though I did like 20 years of social justice. So don't feel like you have to catch every element. My kids are one of the most central things in my life. And I mean, I mentioned them, but it was like, here's a little footnote. Oh, I had some kids. But if you actually knew the fullness of the story, they would be like, let me tell you about my kids the entire time. So don't worry if you miss major elements. We have 20 minutes, 25 minutes to tell your story. So you're going to miss pieces. I'm going to miss pieces. And that's okay. So, and sometimes those are major central pieces of your life. So those are the pieces I wanted to share. So with that, my story, I was born in Burlington, Ontario, also where Mark is from, by the way. So just outside of Toronto. What's that?
I only found out really recently.
We only found that out really recently, yeah. And I always like to tell a little bit of the prehistory. My grandparents, I start there. Actually, my great-grandfather on my dad's side was a United Church minister. Tragic story, apparently. He was a circuit riding preacher and was thrown from his horse. And the way the story gets told, his head was impaled with a frozen corn stalk. And he was killed. And so my grandfather was very young and hated the church because of that, and became an alcoholic. So my dad was an adult child of an alcoholic. I know very little about the maternal side on that side, strangely. Scottish on my paternal dad's side and Dutch. My grandmother was Dutch. My dad was raised by the General Secretary of the United Church. So kind of really, and who worked downtown at what became Much Music, the 299 Queen Street West, was the old Ryerson Publishing House for the United Church. My grandparents on the other side, my grandfather was a church organist, Lutheran church organist, farmer. Both my grandmother and grandfather came from Germany in the early part of the 20th century. Actually, I think technically from what is now Poland, and I have their baptismal certificates from Germany, settled in the prairies, came to New York City, moved across. I still have all his old organ books from the Lutheran Church, actually, but the circuit riding Pentecostal minister came to town and said that all the Lutherans would spend eternity in hell. So they converted to Pentecostalism, as one probably would if that was the threat. And he continued to be a church musician and farmer. Apparently overnight, he threw out the moonshine equipment out back. And so, yeah, so my parents, that was in Manitoba. My dad was in Toronto. My parents met in Toronto at People's Church, which was sort of the precursor of the big kind of evangelical mega church of the time. They met at youth group there, or young adult group, whatever it was, and wanted to live the suburban dream. So moved in the early 70s to Burlington, which was just sort of being developed. And so the house that I grew up in and where my mom still lives was sort of, that was just being built as I was being born. So 46 years ago, I guess, 47 years ago. So that's a little bit of the prehistory. Grew up, so spiritual story, initially in the Baptist church, kind of suburban, white bread Baptist church. And my parents split up when I was 5. I have a brother and a sister. They were born 4 years after me. So I was raised by a single mother with 3 kids under 5. And having had 2 kids at the same time with 2 parents, I gained a whole new respect for my mom because I just can't imagine, like Megan and I struggle many days to do it with 2 of us. And so yeah, different, learned a lot becoming a parent. Suburbia was fine and lots of goodness, but I started to rebel even as a sort of young kid. When my parents split up, we ended up at the Pentecostal church, which is what my mom grew up. Heard about my grandfather, and both my grandfather and grandmother converted. They moved to Winnipeg, by the way, so they joined Calvary Temple. So there's Catherine's town, and so H.H. Barber was he just died last week, actually. He was the sort of pastor who married my parents. It's sort of big Pentecostal church in Winnipeg. So that my whole family were sort of like interwoven in that world of Calvary Temple in Winnipeg. I started to get aware of social justice issues. And part of that was I was in the Pentecostal tradition, it's very much a conversionist tradition and a holiness tradition. So you're supposed to avoid outside stuff from the world. So we weren't supposed to listen to like rock music or even, there was a resistance to like makeup and like women wearing pants and going to movies early on. That changed a little bit, but it was quite a conservative tradition. But within the conservative evangelical tradition, there were these little holes, like you could listen to Bruce Cockburn and you could listen to U2 because they were kind of Christian-ish. And those artists were doing things around social justice, around the environment. And that really spoke to me. Like, I was like, why is this not part of my tradition, but it is for other people? And that kind of bounced me a little bit out of the evangelical tradition. I should say, because it's a conversionist tradition, like you don't sort of inherit your faith, I very much made a conscious choice to be part of that as a kid. Like that's sort of what you do in those traditions. You get on your knees and you say, like, I accept this for myself. And I did that as a 12-year-old, I guess I was. And then being in the Pentecostal tradition, which is very kind of mystical and heavily emotional, that was where I first felt my call to ministry, sort of in this altar call, very mystical. And I had, as I shifted theologically and politically, I had to unwind that a little bit to be like, this was such a powerful thing. And how do I now deal with it now that my like whole lens has changed, and if you've ever seen Jesus Camp, where like this is sort of like what's happening in the US right now, like they're all praying over like George W. Bush that he'll be elected, and that it wasn't quite as political as that, but it had elements of that. And I had shifted so much from that worldview, but I still had this powerful experience of the Holy Spirit that I continue to believe was real and authentic, and it was where I first felt my call to ministry. So that was a big deal for me. Both nature and music became my escape. As I got into my later teens, I was less drawn to church and more into like just spending time in nature. I would, in Southern Ontario, there's like the Bruce Trail and all this sort of, I don't know if it's much there anymore, but North Burlington used to be this sort of farmland, and I would just get out of the city and bike. And I started to play in like garage rock bands, and I started to make electronic music and got really into like that kind of stuff. Went to university and took English literature and religious studies, a double major. The religious studies part is probably the more important one in terms of my faith, because being a conservative evangelical, all of a sudden exposed to all of these religious traditions was such a huge challenge for me. And even though I had sort of widened in terms of gender and environmental and social justice, I didn't know what to do with that. So that was a big deal. And it was, I spent a lot of time in different faith communities, a lot of time in Muslim communities in particular, dated two Muslims, so was really embedded in Pakistani Muslim culture for a few years, both Pakistani and Indian, and lived in the basement of 3 generations of Muslim women for a big chunk of my university life. That I think is interesting in terms of the journey to intentional community, because in suburbia, which was so individualist and so like, this is my little patch, there was I think the call for me to community was like, I can't live this way. But there were these embedded communities in these first generation, like they would just, we need an onion, like just go over to auntie's house and like grab an onion, or, that was sort of the economy that I had always dreamed of living. So it was kind of, I think I grew most in intentional community from these communities that I got to sort of witness as a sort of, and welcomed into in my university years. I got sick of university and decided that after a year or 2 of it, 2 years of it, I guess, to leave. And I went biking. I biked from Toronto to Winnipeg just as a way to like blow off some steam. And that was very epic for me, again, in terms of sort of traveling through Indigenous communities and just camping along the whole way. And it was just a shift out of my head into like something embodied. My university years were marked pretty heavily with activism. I really need to watch my time here. I just keep going. I'm halfway through my like point form. I took a few point form notes so I didn't forget something major in my life. So I'm halfway through them. So I'm about halfway through my time, I think. There was a campus ministry called Student Christian Movement, which has a long, very proud history. And at that point, it was and still is a very kind of left-leaning, sponsored by the United and Anglican and Presbyterian churches. And they were bringing Noam Chomsky, who's a kind of anarchist social justice commentator, linguist. And I was like, there's a Christian group bringing Noam Chomsky. So I got kind of hooked in with them just because I was interested in this. And within a week, I'd gone to my first protest, which happened to be a student tuition protest. And the students broke the doors off the Ontario legislature and legislature. So my baptism into activism was quite intense. It was like, okay, I'm surrounded by riot police in the Ontario legislature here as a like 19-year-old or whatever, 20-year-old, whatever I was. So that was pretty cool. And that started a bit of a process for me of being involved in anti-oppression activism around housing and militarism. I was involved in the Quebec City kind of anti-globalization protests that were huge in the, when was that, late 90s, early 2000s. But interestingly, there was something that I felt missing from that piety of my childhood, which, though I had struggled with as I widened, I missed that. And I felt drawn back into the Christian world. I think, like the Jesus piece, as much as I engaged heavily in different world religions, the Jesus piece never left me. And so I ended up in some conversations, ending up back at the Baptist church. But a Baptist church actually, which probably for me is where the origin of the storytelling comes from, because the pastor there put me in a small group that had like it was like the most, I don't think it was intentionally diverse, but it was like African American or African Canadian gospel singer, queer activist, the chair of the board of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which was it's a kind of conservative evangelical, or at least an evangelical campus ministry group. It was just this, and me, an activist, and it was this, and everybody had to tell their stories, and they took like 2 weeks each to tell their stories. So it was like, here's 3 hours to tell your whole story, and it was the most beautiful time of connection and prayer. And the other thing that happened out of that church was they believed that anybody who was doing ministry, and by this point I was working for Student Christian Movement as a chaplain, obviously a lay chaplain as a 20-year-old, 19-year-old, would be sent on a contemplative retreat every year. So they sent me to the Ignatian Center in Guelph, where I would go on retreats, encountered Ignatian prayer, centering prayer, Taizé, all those things for the first time. And I as an activist, I burnt out 2 or 3 times. And it was there that I started to learn. It's ironic the Baptists sent me to the Catholics to learn contemplation, but it was really powerful that they did. And so, yeah, so that's that. I thought that I would go to seminary at that point after I graduated. So I applied to Union Seminary in New York, which is kind of the big progressive seminary it's where like Bonhoeffer and Niebuhr and more recently like Sally McFaig and Chun Hyung Kung and James Cone and all these sort of very kind of famous theologians gone. I got accepted and I wrote an entrance paper on building communities of resistance. And so very political language, but I think there was a root there of what I feel called into now of like people living and being together. But Union Seminary, I had no denomination I was part of. I was kind of like anti-institutional, whatever. And so I ended up not going to go to Union. It's like it was 28 grand a year US back then. That's 20 plus years ago. And I just couldn't afford that. And so but I also felt God saying to me, live this community stuff. You don't need to study it. So I had couple interesting things happened around that same time. I had come out as bisexual on the front page of the student newspaper, which started a 2-year hate attack against our campus ministry. People were like putting really vile posters, and it was a very painful time, and eventually hate crimes got brought in. And so I was still trying to process who I was and whatever, but and the Student Christian Movement internationally had a big explosion because the African contingent had voted to, quote, remove all the homosexuals from the student Christian movements. And it was split north, south, east, west. And the International World Student Christian Federation said, we're going to do consultations in every region, and we're going to send people to different areas. So I was sent to West Africa, to Togo, for the first ever Pan-African student consultation on same-gender sexuality and HIV and AIDS. This was 2001. September 13th, 2001, I flew 2 days after the famous September 11th, 2001. So the world was in chaos, and it was really beautiful and healing. And I think part of my draw back into an Orthodox faith, into a Christian faith, one of the poignant moments of that, the very end, with a lot of division and a lot of diversity within the African churches, by the way, not the monolith that often gets played out, but as a sort of Western, of 200 people in the room, one of maybe 4 or 5 who had lighter colored skin, they handed me a guitar, which I could barely play, by the way. They said, could you play with us? The church's one foundation is Jesus Christ, her Lord. And I told Mark the story. I was like, that's a really hard song to play on guitar. But but I strummed through it, probably got half the chords wrong, but I was just so moved by the unity in spite of the diversity, theological and spiritual and expressive diversity in the room, that it really shook and shaped me that trip to Togo. And also as the HIV and AIDS thing, which is still obviously a major thing, was huge. And when I landed, just bodies like laid out to die everywhere. And so lot of processing to do coming out of that. I was quite traumatized. And yet the beauty of African Christianity reconverted me, I think, to some of the Pentecostalism of my childhood. Where do I go from West Africa? I moved into the Catholic worker movement. So the Catholic worker was a lay apostolate in the Catholic Church started by Dorothy Day in the 1930s, very activist, but also very Catholic. I moved into the Toronto Catholic Worker in 2001, a few days after coming back from West Africa. And we lived in a house of hospitality that just took in anybody. So we lived with like whoever, and we had 5 houses on this street, living in intentional community. It was really beautiful, really powerful, and I could just tell story after story about God providing food. Like we were out of food, we were out of money, and then like some monk would show up with a turkey, or like our hydro was about to get shut off and somebody would give the exact amount, and we wouldn't know who was coming for dinner, and we'd be able to make these meals. And it was a really powerful and beautiful time. And then I lived there for 5 years, and about 3.5 years in, somebody who'd been living with us for 2.5 years, we had to ask to leave because he'd become really violent, and he had no state, he had no friends or anything. And we tried to work with it, we couldn't. And he came back and killed himself on our front porch. So that was really, really hard. It exposed me to the grittiness of hospitality and relationships. And that was a long process of healing. And we came out of a lot of healing work that we did as a community. We shut down as a community, actually. And the day that we've had a retreat where we're kind of like, we can breathe again, we got a call from the RCMP that one of our community members had been kidnapped in Iraq with Christian peacemaker teams. So my last 2 years in the Catholic worker community were like super intense, because I think it was 8 months that Jim, who had founded this version of the Toronto Catholic worker community, was kidnapped with 3 or 4 others. You probably remember the news around this a few years ago. So CNN was filming through our front window. It was just like weird time. But also God's grace and healing power. And that's actually where I started praying the morning offices, because I was like, the Catholic worker isn't well known for its sort of prayer life. It's more sort of an activist community, but I was like, I need to be rooted in prayer. And so I started to do that and started to learn how to chant Psalms and that kind of thing. And so let me wind down, because I've been 21 minutes exactly. The next part of my life is probably the most important. Well, not this next, the next point isn't that important. I converted to Roman Catholicism, strangely. I was so drawn to the Eucharist, so drawn to the mystery of the Catholic faith, and all these people I was reading, from Richard Rohr to Dorothy Day to Oscar Romero to, and even more conservative Catholic writers and mystics, just drew me into that. So I became Roman Catholic for 5 years. And that's a whole other story unto itself, with lots of beautiful and funny stories within it. And then I fell in love with somebody who was in the United Church. So I met Megan. She had come back from the Philippines, and I was Roman Catholic, but I was working for the National Anglican Church for Primates Fund, which is sort of the global relief and development wing of the Anglican Church. So I'd go to like Jesuit Mass in the morning, go work at the National like Anglican church office, and they wanted to do this pilgrimage. I'd done all these social justice pilgrimage, and they wanted to do this pilgrimage down to the School of the Americas, which had trained all these people to kill leftist insurgents, including a whole bunch of Jesuits and Oscar Romero and all these people. And they were trying to shut it down. It was a big movement. And Megan had come back from the Philippines, also looking for an outlet of some of the pain and struggle she'd experienced there and just what she'd witnessed. So she went on this pilgrimage, and we met on it. And I first remember her dancing in a parking lot in Detroit, outside of Detroit, just this free-spirited dance, and fell in love quickly. And so, that changed. I think what happens when a Roman Catholic marries a United Church person, you both end up being Anglican priests, I guess. And Megan, I think, was also drawn to the Eucharist, and she could tell her own story at some point around those kinds of things. But we sort of met in the middle, and Anglicanism became a place where we landed, and a very, I think, good and maybe not comfortable place for me, but at least a place where I could root myself. We co-founded with some other folks, my friend Lance Dixon, who was an Anglican priest, an intentional community in Toronto, which we did for about 4 years. And it, because of all sorts of misplacement within the institution, imploded and put a lot of pressure on us. We had 2 beautiful children in there. And the pressure on our family life and the pressure on us as a couple and the pressure on that community became unbearable. And somebody said, why don't you move to Victoria, which is where Megan was born? Diane knows some of that story, apparently. So we made a decision in faith with no job, no anything. This kind of marked our marriage. We were like, where are we going to move to? And we just moved somewhere, and it worked out. And let's move west. We don't have a job yet, but let's just do it. And we did. And again, God's grace has felt really present in that. And of course, the blessing now and struggle of family, but the blessing of family and of children. And then, the last, so that was 7 years ago that we moved out here to BC. And it's really been this sort of trying to find our place. How do we live in the way we're called? And so Emmaus, I think, has been, at least for us, and then for other people who've become part of it, a real questioning point. And it ties back to that first question of what do I have to bring to this? There are many days I feel like I can't bring anything to it and I just fumble through it. But there is, it was Megan who, we were pretty scarred from the experience in Toronto, or at least I was, I won't speak for her, but she was like, we are called to this life of community, and this has been a theme in our life for both of us. Let's try and do it again. And so we did. So yeah, I think that's a bit of my story. There's whole big chunks I've missed out there, but that's sort of the overview, and I've gone way over my time. So yeah. And I have to say, every time I tell that story, I feel like a whirlwind, and then I'm exhausted telling it after. It's just so much blah, blah, blah. So I don't know if it would be the same experience for other people who tell it, but so thank you for listening to all of that speedily told story.
If there's a couple people that want to, thanks, Rob, by the way.
Thank you.
If there's a couple people that sensed or noticed a theme or want to articulate anything in which they notice God's grace and the Holy Spirit working in Rob's life as he's sharing his story, you're welcome to.
I clearly noticed how you made decisions very strong decisions and stepped out in faith. And God really has honored that every single time you did it. And that was one of the things I really noticed.
Thank you, Marion.
I mean, we've talked recently and about your story and my story, things like that in the last little bit, what I find really sort of inspiring about your story in a similar way about like reaching out in faith, but you also you're sort of proof that our lives are, we come into our lives thinking that our life is a trajectory that goes here and sort of ends there. And your story reminds me that the trajectory is not always a straight line. And it really weaves through a lot of very different places. And I think sometimes sometimes we get a little bit caught up with the end goal or things like that and how we get there. And I think you're a living proof that that's not actually how life works.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, it's hard to just move on, but we are going to move on. Catherine, thank you so much for being willing to jump in and share your story. I'll let you.
Yeah, I don't want to move on. I now know why it took 2 weeks for you all to tell your stories, because I don't even know what to do with that.
I will stop, just to be fair here, I will stop recording because I know I promised people that I recorded mine, and I can edit mine out from what I send people, but I'll stop recording for you, Catherine, if you're